I'm Mike Perry. I'm the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation, the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center located at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. The center is the Army's premier research facility on the history and heritage of the U.S. Army and its soldiers. Tonight, we're pleased to host Daniel James Brown as our speaker. Daniel grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and attended Diablo Valley College, the University of California at Berkeley, and UCLA. He taught writing at San Jose University and Stanford before becoming a technical writer and editor. Brown now writes narrative nonfiction books full-time. His primary interest as a writer is bringing compelling historical events to life as vividly and accurately as possible. Including tonight's book, Daniel Brown has written four: Under a Flaming Sky, The Great Hinckley Firestorm of 1894, The Indifferent Stars Above, The Harrowing Saga of a Donner Party Bride, The Boys in the Boat, 9 Americans and Their Epic Quest for Gold in the 1936 Olympics. Those are the history. So he tries to bring history to life by making it much more personal. So tonight, he's going to talk about some Nisei soldiers and one who decided not to serve, and give a perspective of what it was like to grow up as a Japanese American during World War II. Dan, the floor is now yours.
Thanks so much for having me. This new book of mine, Facing the Mountain, basically weaves together the stories of 4 young Japanese American men, all of whom were of draft age when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. Their stories, and very importantly, the stories of their families. 3 of the 4 wound up serving in the U.S. Army, and the 4th was a resistor. And I thought what we might do, if we're able to bring up the pictures of them, I thought I might just talk a little bit about each of these young men in turn, and then we can talk a little bit also along the way about the unit they served in. So this first young man, Fred Shiasaki. Fred was the son of Japanese immigrants. He was born in Spokane, as I recall, and he grew up in Spokane, Washington. His family ran a laundry, and they lived in a little apartment above the laundry. Shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Fred, like all his classmates and his friends at John Rogers High School in Spokane, went downtown Spokane and tried to enlist. But because he was of Japanese descent, when Fred went into the enlistment office, he was told that he couldn't enlist, that he was in fact something called an enemy alien. And this absolutely stunned Fred. He was a particularly sort of all-American kid, and he really didn't know what to make of the fact that as an American citizen, he couldn't serve. So he spent a pretty unhappy year working at the laundry and going to Gonzaga University in Spokane, which by then had been turned into a training facility for naval cadets, if I remember correctly. So the only men on campus that weren't in uniform were Fred and just a handful of other people. And so he found it to be a very humiliating experience. In January of 1943, February, the Roosevelt administration reversed course and decided to create an all-Japanese American segregated unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And Fred immediately went downtown again and signed up, and then was shipped off to Camp Shelby in Mississippi for basic training. And I'll talk a little bit more about Camp Shelby in a minute when we get to some of the other young men. But Fred was just this really kind of sweet, good-hearted kid. His Army nickname was Rosie because his cheeks tended to pink up when he got excited. Actually, maybe what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and talk about basic training while I'm at it. When Fred showed up at basic training in as I say, Camp Shelby, Mississippi, it was not like your usual basic training experience. I mean, it had all the same rigors that basic training had for millions of other young American men. But it turned out that about half the young men who signed up for the 442nd were from the mainland. And many of them had come out of these camps where their families had been incarcerated and forced to remove from their homes and incarcerated. So about half of the kids, I call them kids, these young men in basic training were kids from the mainland like Fred. The other half, though, were young men from Hawaii. And the young men from Hawaii grew up with a very different set of life experiences than the mainland young men. Many of them had grown up on sugarcane plantations. They spoke pidgin English almost exclusively. And they had a sort of very laid back Hawaiian kind of attitude towards life. The guys from the mainland felt very differently. They were very serious young men. Many of them had been students, at UCLA or University of Washington or wherever. And they came into basic training determined to prove their loyalty to the United States and very upset about the fact that their parents and their families, and in many cases themselves, had been incarcerated in the camps. So when these two groups met, the sort of hang loose kids from Hawaii and the mainland young men, it was like mixing oil and water. They didn't get along at all. For one thing, the mainlanders literally couldn't understand what the Hawaii guys were saying when they talked. They spoke pidgin, and the two sides had a terrible time communicating, and both sides felt disrespected, and fistfights started breaking out all over the camp the first few weeks at Camp Shelby. In fact, the commanders actually considered disbanding the whole idea of this 442nd Regimental Combat Team because the two groups didn't seem as if they'd ever merge to become an effective fighting force. What finally happened was one of the chaplains for the 442nd decided to take a lot of the guys from Hawaii, put them on buses, and he took them to one of these camps where Japanese Americans were being held. There happened to be two camps in Arkansas, not far from Camp Shelby in Mississippi. So he put these Hawaii kids on the buses, took them to these camps in Arkansas. And for the first time, the guys from Hawaii saw, other old ladies and children who looked just like them behind barbed wire with machine guns in the guard towers aimed inward at them rather than outward. And this really shocked the guys from Hawaii. They hardly knew these camps existed. So from that moment on, they began to understand the attitude of the mainland guys better. And the two groups, it took a while, but the two groups began to get together. And by the time they shipped overseas, they had in fact become a very cohesive, a particularly cohesive and effective fighting force. So I could go on, but if we do have a picture of any of the other guys, I can tie some of what I have to say to some faces.
Right now we have Rudy's picture up.
Oh, I'm looking at Fred. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. I may not be seeing what you are. So that's a picture that I think you're looking at of Rudy leading a group of German soldiers across the American lines. So let me tell you how they got there. After basic training, the 442nd was shipped originally they landed at Anzio just after the Allied breakout at Anzio had taken place, a couple of days afterwards. So they moved quickly through Rome, and about 50 kilometers north of Rome, they encountered their first battles and their first resistance. They spent that summer fighting their way north through Tuscany, a series of hilltop towns, all of which the Germans held. So these guys were always fighting their way uphill against Germans firing downhill. And this picture was taken near the end of that first campaign, in Tuscany. And it depicts, as I said, Rudy at the front of the column, and a bunch of Germans who have just surrendered, and Rudy's just bringing them in across the lines. Rudy Tokiwa grew up in Salinas, California. He was actually in one of the camps where he volunteered for service out of Poston, a particularly hot and miserable camp in Arizona. Rudy was Rudy was a really interesting guy. He was kind of a rascal. He didn't always like to follow Army regulations real strictly, and he often got in trouble. He was also really good, though, at sort of being sneaky. And so pretty early on in the campaign in Italy, Lieutenant Colonel Purcell took an interest in him and began to give him missions where he slipped behind the German lines and was tasked with trying to capture Germans who left themselves exposed. And that's exactly what's happening in this picture here. And it really is a testament. He was also, his other job in the 442nd was as a runner. So he often found himself either behind German lines or crossing active battlefields trying to get messages from one unit to another. But again, he was particularly good at this because he sort of had a talent for being evasive and was very good at it. He was wounded late in the war, and we may come back to that a little later. But a really interesting, really spirited young man. And then you'll have to tell me what we're looking at in terms of slides. If we have Katz Miho, that would be good, because he was the third guy who served in the 442nd. Yeah, there's Katz. So Katz, another really interesting guy. This is a picture of him playing football. Well, I think it's a posed picture. I don't think he's really playing here, but a picture of him in his uniform at Maui High. Katz grew up on the island of Maui at a time when Maui and all the Hawaiian Islands pretty much were run as huge sugarcane and pineapple plantations. So he was one of that Hawaii contingent that I mentioned earlier that grew up. And Katz could speak really good standard English, but he also could really speak Pidgin, and so he was very much one of the Hawaii guys. He was very popular in high school, and a super student. He was actually the student body president his senior year at Maui High, kind of a football star there. He went on, and he was a student at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu on the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So 80 years ago yesterday, today's the 8th, I think, Katz was awakened by the sound of people yelling in the downstairs of this residence hall that he lived in, and people yelling to turn on the radio. Turned on the radio and began to get a sense of what was happening. He and some friends actually climbed out on the roof of Atherton House, this residence hall that they were living in. And from there, they could see these pillars of smoke coming up from the Pearl Harbor area and Japanese Zeros circling and diving overhead. In fact, an errant bomb fell not far at all from where he was that morning. He because he was at the University of Hawaii, he was a member of the ROTC at Hawaii. And he and all the other ROTC cadets, many of whom, probably most of whom actually were Japanese Americans, rushed across the street and assembled in the gymnasium there, I think it was. And they were that afternoon formed into something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. They were issued old 1903, I think it was, Springfield rifles and 5 rounds of ammunition. And that night they were sent to various places around Honolulu to defend against what everybody expected would be a massive Japanese invasion at any time. So the night of December 7th, Katz was down on the Honolulu waterfront patrolling with this rifle he didn't really know how to use. Unfortunately, about a month into their service as the Hawaii Territorial Guard, all the young men of Japanese descent were summarily dismissed from their service on the basis of their ancestry. So Katz, like Fred Shiasaki, was kind of devastated by this. He didn't understand how this could be happening. He went back to Maui. His family ran a sort of family hotel on Maui. And he spent the next year working as a carpenter, helping to build US military facilities on Maui, until in the spring of 1943, the 442nd was finally created. He and almost 10,000 young Japanese American men from Hawaii volunteered immediately to serve in the 442nd. I think of that 10,000, about 2,400, something like that, were actually taken. So he joined the 442nd, went through that basic training experience I talked about earlier at Camp Shelby, and then was shipped overseas. He was with the 522nd, the Field Artillery Unit for the 442nd. And he participated in a series of battles in Italy. I should tell you, sort of after that Italian campaign, the 442nd was then, they had begun to earn a tremendous battlefield record, and were considered a particularly valuable unit. So they were shipped from northern Italy. They were shipped to the French-German border in the late summer, fall of 1944. And they were tasked with, as the Allies were pressing up against the German border, they were tasked with liberating a town called Bruyères. Bruyères is on the fringes of the Vosges forest, a sort of dark, mountainous, more or less impenetrable terrain. It's the Black Forest on the other side, the German side. So they were tasked with liberating this French town. They fought a very fierce battle in October of 1944 to liberate Bruyères, and after taking a lot of casualties, they did. And then they were ordered to push deeper into the Vosges forest, again, pressing the Germans back towards their border. And then that is where the incident that the 442nd is most known for happened. After the battle for Bruyères, after I think 3 or 4 days of very heavy fighting, the 442nd was told to take a break, take a couple nights to get some rest. So these guys went off and found barns or cellars or places to try to get some sleep and rest. But on the second night, they were awakened abruptly and told to put their combat gear back on, that they were going back into battle. And what had happened was General John Dahlquist, who was the commanding general of the 36th Division's 141st Regiment, often called the Texas Army. These were young men, mostly originally from Texas and Oklahoma National Guard. Dahlquist had ordered, I believe it was part of his 1st Battalion of the 141st, deeper into the Vosges, really deeper than he should have, into country that hadn't been reconnoitered. And about 200, 250 of these young men from Texas and Oklahoma got cut off and surrounded by the Germans on the end of a long ridge line. Dahlquist, knowing, I think, that he had blundered, sent one unit after another up that mountain trying to get through to those guys. The Texans many of them were wounded. They ran out of food. They had almost no medical supplies. A number of them had died by the 2nd or 3rd day of this entrapment. Nobody had been able to get through to them. So finally, Dahlquist awakened this all Japanese American fighting unit, the 442nd, and sent them up the mountain to try to break through to these Texas boys. And there followed an absolutely hellacious battle. The Nisei soldiers, the Japanese American soldiers, fighting their way up through extremely steep and formidable terrain under bitter cold conditions. It was raining and snowing and mud and everything you don't want to have happen. And they fought tenaciously, and they did finally break through and reach the surrounded Texans and begin to bring them down off the mountain. They actually were not allowed to come down off the mountain themselves. They were ordered to push deeper into the Vosges. So it was days more before they actually managed to come back down. But they essentially rescued there have been a number of lost battalions in US military history, but this is one of those incidents that came to be referred to as the Lost Battalion. So that was sort of, in many ways, the 442nd's most glorious moment, I suppose. They went on then, they were then eventually sent back to Italy to continue the campaign in Italy. So this is basically their third campaign. And they were tasked with breaking through the Gothic line in far northern Italy, which they did by climbing the back of a mountain, Monte Folgorito, in the middle of the night, surprising the Germans. They punched a hole in the left, that is the westernmost end of the Gothic line, and greatly hastened the Fifth Army's ability to pour north into the Po Valley, where the Germans began to surrender. I want to say one other thing about Katz while we've got him up here. While the rest of the 442nd was back in Italy breaking through the Gothic line, the field artillery that Katz was part of was detached from the 442nd. They were sent back to Germany. And we're talking now about April 1945. So they are pushing into Germany as the German forces collapse. And they, in particular, their unit is Katz, and many of his fellows were scouting. They were often in jeeps out ahead of the main force, scouting for targets for the artillery as they pushed into southern Bavaria, past Munich. And just outside of Munich, they came across the complex of Dachau, not the main camp at Dachau, but Dachau was really a system of slave labor camps. And surrounding the main camp, there were, I forget the absolute number, but there were many sub-camps where the Germans had confined prisoners and were using them as slave laborers. The 442nd guys, the field artillery guys, I should say, came across them and participated in liberating a number of those sub-camps in the very last days of the operation in Germany. So that's the three guys that the book focuses on in terms of military history. The fourth guy in the book, and again, the book is about their families as much as about themselves, I think, in some ways, is a young man named Gordon Hirobayashi. And I thought it was important in telling this story to recognize that while thousands of young Japanese Americans volunteered to serve in the military, there were also thousands, particularly in the camps, who did not feel that as long as their families were incarcerated behind barbed wire, that they should participate in the U.S. government's in any way, basically, and including the military. So Gordon sort of stands for that group in the book. He's a really interesting young man. He was a student at the University of Washington when Pearl Harbor happened. One of the first things that happened to Japanese Americans in Seattle was that an 8 p.m. curfew was imposed on them. Anybody of Japanese descent was not allowed to be out on the streets after 8 p.m. Gordon at first obeyed that curfew, and then one day when he was in the library, studying with some fellow white students, it occurred to him that he didn't really understand why he was having to go home at 8 p.m. when his classmates and friends didn't. So Gordon began to just simply defy the curfew. In fact, he began to keep a journal in which he noted down the times when he was out after 8 p.m. So that he could document it later. And then when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to, get on these buses with whatever possessions they could carry with them and be taken off to what were called assembly centers, which were temporary holding facilities, usually at fairgrounds and racetracks, and then ultimately to one of the permanent camps. When the time came for people in Seattle to get on these buses, Gordon just didn't get on the bus. He became the last and only Japanese American person living in Seattle after the last bus left. And what he did instead was he wrote a long, detailed, very carefully reasoned out statement explaining why he believed that both the curfew and the removal from their homes violated the United States Constitution. And the day that he was supposed to get on the bus, he went downtown Seattle and he walked into the FBI office there and handed them this statement, which caused all kinds of confusion because Gordon was literally the only person in the entire state of Washington that just didn't get on the buses. So the FBI agents spent the rest of the day driving him around from place to place in Seattle, trying to get him to sign the form. The issue was Gordon wouldn't sign the form, the registration form, that would allow him to be incarcerated in one of these camps. He said, put me in the back of the car, drive me down to the camp. I can't stop you from doing that, but I'm not going to sign your form. So at the end of the day, that day, he wound up in the King County Jail, which is still there in Seattle. And then that began a long process of legal battles that eventually worked its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, where actually he lost. But he was in and out of jails and prisons throughout the rest of the war, waging this legal battle. So those are the four guys, and very quick, sort of snapshot overview synopsis of their stories. And I'd be really happy to elaborate on any, I skimmed over so many things. I'd be happy to elaborate on any questions or things folks might want to know more about.
If you have a question, if you'd use the question and icon image, and please note the question, then I'll pass it on to Dan. So if you have questions, please use the question and answer icon. I'll ask first. They all came back.
Yeah.
And where do they settle once they came back?
So, that's kind of, when you're writing a book like this, you wish there was sort of this big triumphant ending for your heroes at the end, because a lot of these guys really were heroes. The 442nd wound up being the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in American military history, apparently. So a lot of them came, although many of those medals were not awarded until decades later, I should say. They came back in dribs and drabs, many of, as you probably know, GIs weren't often able to leave Europe immediately. They were needed in Europe to do all kinds of functions. So they came back over the subsequent months, which meant that most of them were coming back about the same time that their parents and their grandparents and their siblings were being let out of these camps. And as I say, it would be nice to think that it all ended heroically for them. But in fact, when they came back, they faced a lot of the same sort of, vitriol and prejudice that they had faced when they left. It was particularly bad right after Pearl Harbor, of course, because people were so angry. But many of them came back. My father, for instance, was in the flower business in San Francisco, and we had many, many Japanese American, I worked in the business too, we had many Japanese American florists and nurserymen. When they came back after the war, almost universally, their greenhouses had been shattered with rocks, and the land they had been growing on had been taken out from underneath them. Many of them had stored their possessions in garages or wherever they could find to store them. Much of that had been looted in many cases. So it was a mixed bag, I should say about this. So some people really took advantage of Japanese Americans during this period. There were also people that tried very much to help. There were families, white families, that volunteered to take care of the family farm or take the family pets or store goods for these families that were being forced out of their homes. So it was a very mixed bag. But the bottom line is when they got back, when they got home, a lot of them encountered still a great deal of prejudice. And the recognition of the 442nd, I should say the 442nd did get fairly well celebrated in newsreels, but it didn't really penetrate the American consciousness until decades later, just exactly what these guys had done. And when a fuller accounting was made of some of the heroics, both in Italy and in the Vosges forest and back in northern Italy, eventually the medals and the recognitions began to come, and they were finally more recognized in subsequent decades.
Larry is asking a question about how this demonstrates the racist nature of our nation since its inception, and asks if there any hope this attitude will change. Will you discuss a little bit about the difference between what happened on the West Coast and what occurred in the Hawaiian Islands?
Yeah, so first of all, it was, in terms of the West Coast and Hawaii, it is interesting. Hawaii was at the time, a much more multicultural place than the West Coast was. So Hawaii, although the plantation system was really very brutal and racially stratified, Hawaiian society in general was more integrated and more culturally diverse than the mainland. So the Hawaii guys, for instance, when they showed up in Mississippi of all places, they were absolutely shocked when they saw, Jim Crow, signs of Jim Crow. When they got off the train, literally in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and they saw there were restrooms for whites and for blacks, they did not, or for coloreds, it said, they didn't know which ones they were supposed to use. So the Hawaii guys were really kind of shocked by the sort of racial situation on the mainland. On the mainland, there was a lot of racism that went back, and it really had deep roots, particularly along the West Coast. And that goes back to the days of Chinese immigration to the San Francisco area, particularly in the 1840s and 1850s, when those first waves of Chinese immigrants came. And in the decades following that, there was a lot of violence directed at them. And then a little later, around the turn of the century, this notion of, quote, the yellow peril arose in the newspapers and also in Hollywood, where the notion arose that Asian immigrants were bringers of disease. They were equated with locusts and rats and snakes and plagues. And that was a very common sort of understanding, or a series of tropes or images or phrases got built into the American consciousness during those years. Very, very unfortunate. And then when Pearl Harbor happened, all that just came bubbling up to the top. And all those, those images and those associations that had been built up from the 1800s and the early part of the 20th century. They were already there. They were ready made, and they were just flung against Japanese people of Japanese descent, in really a blind way, and that took no, that really failed to understand how American these people were. So it's a deeply embedded thing. We've seen waves of it through our whole history. I get pretty discouraged, frankly, by the fact that it keeps coming up. When I was writing this book, I'd be reading, studying during the daytime. I'd be studying about these hardworking immigrant families, and then coming home and hearing on the news all this anti-immigrant rhetoric. And so, it's just there. It's baked into the fabric of our society, and it's really hard to deal with. I hope we're making progress.
This question's from Catherine. I'm not sure how it's affiliated. She wants to know about the secret war dogs of Cat Island.
Oh, yes. I don't really talk. I mentioned that only briefly in the book, but and I think these guys were from the 100th. So I have to back up a little bit and say that before the 442nd was created, there was one other all Japanese American unit. That was the 100th Infantry Battalion. And it was formed out of what had been the National Guard in Hawaii. So it was largely Japanese American. After Pearl Harbor, that National Guard unit was federalized. They were turned into US troops, but the government didn't know what to do with all these Japanese American soldiers who had been in the National Guard or who had been drafted just before the war. They didn't know what to do with Japanese American soldiers already in the military. So they eventually created the 100th Infantry Battalion. It eventually became, in effect, the 1st Battalion of the 442nd, but it had an earlier date of origin. So they got to their basic training earlier than the 442nd guys did. I believe it was from that group that the military got it, somebody in the hierarchy got it in his, I assume, head that Japanese people of Japanese descent, smell different than other people. And so they took a bunch of these young men and they put them on this island. Can't remember where it was, off the South Carolina coast, maybe. And these guys' job was to run through the woods and hide while dogs tried to sniff them out, because they were trying to train dogs to smell Japanese people, which of course was preposterous. So, so the fact that dogs would eventually find these guys, the guys would pat them on the head and send them on their ways. But it was, really a horrible, ridiculous thing.
Next question is from Ed. Ed wanted to know if any other of these men had siblings who served in the war or did not serve.
Yes, so a number of them had siblings that served and some had siblings that didn't serve. When they had siblings that didn't serve, in some cases that really tore families apart, although usually within families, either the young men served in a different family, they decided they shouldn't serve, and that caused a big division amongst the families in the camps. But within families, generally, they went one way or the other. But a lot of them had, a lot of these guys had brothers who served. And in fact, Katz Miho, who we saw earlier, Katz from Hawaii, when it was finally decided that they could sign up for the 442nd, he and his brother, Katsuaki, sat up all night arguing about which of them should go, which of them should represent the Miho family in the war. And they debated it all night. They both wanted to be the one that went. And finally, the next morning, they decided they were both going to go. So, and they did. They shipped off to basic training. Unfortunately, Katsuaki was killed in an automobile accident during basic training. He actually became the first casualty in the 442nd. So Katz lost a brother that way. But there were other sets of brothers. There's a set that I talk about in the book, the Sato brothers, 3 of whom were in the military, and they were writing. They were in the 442nd. 2 of them were in the 442nd. Another was in another unit. They were writing all these letters home to their father, and these letters are heartbreaking because they're writing letters home to their father, and then the Battle of Hill 140, one of them is killed, and so the other has to write home to tell his father about the death of his brother, and he's writing these letters, and then when they get to the Battle of Bruyere, he is killed. So, and there were other instances where single families lost 2 or more young men within the same family.
We have a tendency to focus on the Japanese Americans in the 442nd. Did they serve in the other services, and were they in segregated units?
No, there weren't a lot. There were some scattered, some who had been in the military earlier or who were drafted in later, because eventually the government went from not allowing Japanese Americans to serve all the way to actually conscripting them by 1944, I think. So there were some that were drafted and wound up in other units, some that had been in the Army before and wound up in other units. But not very many. There was a fascinating young man named Ben Kuroki, who his story it really deserves a book of its own. A true war hero, fought very early. Was on a series of, I think he was a navigator, a series of daring bombing raids in Europe and then later in Japan. He was given the job because he was a recognized war hero. He went, when he was ever stateside, he went to these camps. There were 10 of these camps. Ben Kuroki would go into these camps and evangelize for the military and try to talk young men into enlisting. And as I say, he was not in the 100th or the 442nd, I believe.
The Chinese American experience is a little bit different. We looked at a couple of them. In fact, they were, I was at a ceremony presenting them their congressional gold medals about 2-3 weeks ago. But they were dispersed. They did not put them in all Chinese units. In fact, the one gentleman that we focused on a story a couple of years ago was the only Chinese American in his regiment, almost in the division. And he actually came from Philadelphia, served out west, and then goes in Europe. So that the Chinese American experience seems to be significantly different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sensitivity around Japanese Americans, of course, was because we were at war with Japan. And so military people had a particular concern because of that. It turned out to be entirely misplaced. I should also point out, though, there are a couple of things my book doesn't talk about that are enormously important. One of those is that as these young men signed up for the 442nd, they all took batteries of aptitude tests, and also they took tests in their proficiency with Japanese language. Many of them didn't speak any Japanese at all, but some of them did. And those who had a high enough aptitude and who also spoke really good Japanese were diverted into the Military Intelligence Service, the MIS. They were then, I think it was at Camp Savage, primarily, they were given specialized training, and they wound up, of course, in the South Pacific. Many of them served on ships or offshore, listening into Japanese transmissions, helping to decode transmissions or translate transmissions. But others were actually on the ground with US troops in Southeast Asia, and the islands as the islands were taken. And their job primarily was to interrogate Japanese POWs, again, because of their language skill. So they served at great risk, of course, because they were of Japanese descent. There was enormous concern about them being captured by the Japanese and meeting a very, very bad fate.
As you move towards the end of the war, and people were released on the point system, or allowed to go back on the point system,
yeah.
Were there any members of the 442nd that maybe were replacements that may have been transferred into the Pacific? And did they consider using some of the Japanese infantry type soldiers in the Pacific theater?
Yeah, I don't believe so. I believe only the MIS was used in the Pacific theater. A lot of them, a lot of folks were just coming into the 442nd as the war ended, and they either went to Europe and served, as other guys were earning enough points and coming home, or they served stateside. I'm not aware of any of them, well, within the 442nd actually going to Asia.
Okay. When did you do your research?
So this whole project started in 2015 when I met a guy named Tom Ikeda. Tom has for 25 years now been collecting, videotaping, recording, collecting the firsthand oral histories of Japanese Americans, particularly of the World War II generation. And he's recorded hundreds and hundreds of these interviews, and he puts them all on his website, which is densho.org, and he has all kinds of other materials, the newsletters from the camps, and it's just this wonderful resource. I met Tom in 2015 at an awards ceremony where we were both receiving an award. And he talked about what he was doing, and I just really, pricked my interest. So I went home that night and I got on to his website, and I just sat down. I started listening to some of these mostly now old men talking about their experiences as young men, and some older women talking about their experiences in the camps. And there were so many really interesting stories, really compelling stories about really earnest young Americans trying to deal with this really difficult situation. So I went back to Tom, and he and I started talking about maybe I should do a book. And so I worked with him for the next several years to sort of narrow it down to the guys we wound up picking to focus on. And then through Tom, largely, I was able to meet the family members of most of these guys. I wanted to make sure the families were okay with me telling their father or their grandfather's story. And they also often, in many cases, were able to give me letters or diaries or photographs that helped me with their research. So from mid 2015 on, for the next 5 years, basically, I was running all over the countryside, talking to families. I also spent a lot of time, in doing traditional research in archives. The University of Hawaii in Honolulu has wonderful collections of materials related to the 442nd and the 100th. The Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles has wonderful stuff. So a lot of time, going into dusty old archives and finding letters and things like that. And a lot of time just sort of reading background books to get a general understanding of that phase of the war. But mostly just talking to family members and getting the firsthand experiences.
Catherine wants to ask a question. The Japanese American wax?
I don't think so. Very late in the process of researching the book, I was aware there are definitely women in the story. There's very compelling women's stories woven into the book, but I began to wonder myself about whether any served as wax, and I don't think so. Quite a large number of young women, Nisei women, came out of the camps later in the war to serve in a couple different nurse cadet training programs. So many nurses, already trained nurses, were serving overseas, both in Asia and in Europe, that the nursing staff at US hospitals were under tremendous strain. So a lot of them, these say women, wound up getting trained as and serving as nurses here stateside.
Okay. Anything in closing you'd like to say before I ask you to highlight a little bit about those other books, because I only named them. I didn't tell people what they were about.
Sure. Just, I think this story, I didn't realize how timely it was going to be as I began writing the book, but as I've, worked through writing it and met all these family members, I think it's a really important thing for all of us, particularly those of us who aren't Japanese American, to learn more about. I learned so much. I mean, I learned so much that's in the book, but I also learned so much more that I couldn't get into the book about the experience of their immigrant parents, the reality of what life in those camps was like, the reality of what so many of them did on battlefields. You can only get so much of that in a book, and for every story in the book, there's hundreds. I really encourage people actually to go to Densho, the website, and they can listen to Rudy Tokiwa or Fred Shiasaki or any of these folks talk about their experiences, right? Looking them in the eye. It's a really useful thing to do. So I just think it's a time when it's a really important piece of American history for all of us, as I say, particularly those of us who aren't Japanese American, to learn more about.
Under the Flaming Sky.
Yeah, so that was my first book. All my books have arisen out of some kind of a personal experience or connection. Under a Flaming Sky, when I was growing up, I knew from my mother, she told us that when he was a very young boy, her father had survived this terrible forest fire in Minnesota, and that he had escaped from the fire on a train that had caught fire as it was backing out of town. And that's about all I knew about it. So I decided, I think it was in 2000, I wanted to know more about it. And my mom had left this box of stuff that she had saved about it. So I dove into this box and I started pulling out all these old newspaper clippings and a couple old books and photographs that my grandfather had saved. And I learned about this incredible event. I mean, actually 2 forest fires converged on this little town called Hinckley, Minnesota, pretty much trapping everybody in the town. They tried to evacuate the town. There were 2 trains in the town. They tried to evacuate them by backing them out of town. The one that my grandfather was on, his father, my great-grandfather, died fighting the fire. But my grandfather and his mother were on the train that caught fire. They had to actually jump off the train and immerse themselves in a swamp up to their noses to survive. The other train made it out of town just after a trestle that was burning collapsed. Anyway, all kinds of really heroic things happened that day. And it turned out to be a really interesting, very dramatic event. And so that was my first book, which I wrote.
Donner Party Bride.
Pardon?
What brought you to the Donner Party Bride?
The Donner Party Bride, again, was a personal connection, weirdly. I have a distant family relationship, not with a member of the Donner Party. For anybody that doesn't know, the Donner Party was this bunch of overland immigrants who were trapped in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1846, and they began to starve, and there was cannibalism, all kinds of horrible things happened to them. I have a family member who was a member of the first rescue expedition that went up into the Sierra Nevada to try to get to, and did get to, the Donner Party to bring survivors out. And when I was a little boy, I saw a journal that he had kept, and I was allowed to handle it and look at it. So I'd always had this fascination with the Donner Party. And I discovered that, it's been written about quite a bit there, but there was this one young woman named Sarah Graves who was part of a party of relatively young, healthy people who actually tried to hike out of the Sierra Nevada that winter. And of the 15, I think it was, of them who set off to try to make it through to California, I should remember this. I think 5 of them survived. So the book focuses largely on her as one of the survivors who was able to actually, under terribly difficult circumstances, hike out of the Sierra Nevada and get word to what became the first rescue expedition back up into the mountains. So again, very dramatic story.
We talked a little bit about the boys of the boat, but again, they sort of lost out. We talked about the Jesse Owens story, but who were these young men?
Yeah, so this was Boys in the Boat is about the University of Washington rowing crew in 1936. It went to the Berlin Olympics and won a gold medal racing against both an Italian and a German boat. So the two fascist powers just at the time when the Nazis were coming to power. And in fact, Hitler and Goebbels and Goering and all the Nazis were there that day and watched this race in which the Americans beat the Germans out for the gold medal. So the race itself is very dramatic. The book is really largely, though, about what happened before that. It's about these farm kids, basically, from Washington State who came together to become one of the greatest rowing crews of all time, and one that was able to go east and beat the crews at, schools like Princeton and Harvard. And they actually didn't row against those two schools, but Ivy League schools, and then go on and row against and defeat kids from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. So really sort of improbable story of working class kids against all odds, achieving this dream. And that's the book that has become most popular for me. And then the last one is this Facing the Mountain.
I want to thank you for tonight. A bunch of folks have asked for that website address. What I'll do is I'll get it from you, Dan, and I'll post it or I'll send it out on an email for people who want to look at that particular website. So thanks for coming tonight. I do want to highlight our next program is next Tuesday, not Wednesday, next Tuesday at 7 p.m. We're staying back, in a sense, out in the Far East. We have, we're going to look at the book's called American Datu, John Pershing and the Counterinsurgency Warfare in Muslim Philippines from 1899 to 1913.